In the pale light of an early medieval dawn, when the mist still lingered like a dream over the rolling hills of old Europe, a castle stood half asleep upon its lonely hill. Its towers caught the first touches of morning, glinting faintly through the fog, and if one listened closely, they could almost hear the faint stirring of servants, the creak of wooden doors, and the distant toll of a bell marking another day in royal life. From the outside, it looked like heaven, stone walls kissed by the sun, banners fluttering proudly, guards at attention with polished armor gleaming. But inside, behind the velvet curtains and gold, life for royalty was not what the songs promised. It was strange, cold, and endlessly tiring. The royal family of Castelbell had ruled for generations, and though their names were sung by minstrels across the land, their daily lives were built from routines that never changed. The king, the queen, the princes, and their courtiers, all were trapped within their own golden schedule, where every gesture had meaning and every silence was measured. At the center of this glittering prison was young Prince Aldrich, not yet 20, but already carrying the heavy expectations of a dynasty. He awoke each morning not to the chirping of birds or the warmth of comfort, but to the soft murmuring of attendants who entered before dawn. They spoke in whispers, careful not to wake him too abruptly, and drew back the curtains to let in the first gray light. The chamber was vast, yet strangely lonely. Golden embroidery covered every corner, but it could not fill the emptiness. Aldrich's bed, high and grand, was surrounded by tapestries depicting battles he never fought and triumphs he did not earn. His first thought each morning was not of joy, but of duty. "Your Highness, the water is warm," murmured one servant, pouring from a bronze jug into a basin. "The king has already risen." Aldrich nodded faintly. The servants helped him wash, their movements quiet and practiced. They combed his hair, fastened his tunic, tied the laces on his shoes. He was capable of doing it all himself, of course, but such things were forbidden. Royals were not meant to show self-sufficiency. They were to appear effortless, untouched by labor or need. After dressing came the meal, but even breakfast was a ceremony. He sat at a long table, though he ate alone. Servants stood at attention, waiting for his nod before each dish was served. Plates of bread, cheese, figs, and boiled eggs were laid out, though Aldrich barely touched them. The hall echoed with quietness. In that stillness, he often thought of the villagers beyond the castle walls, the men and women who woke at dawn, worked in the fields, laughed together, and shared humble meals with warmth and noise. They were supposed to envy him, the prince who lived in silk and marble. Yet Aldrich, in secret, envied them. When the meal ended, a tutor arrived with a stack of scrolls. Lessons filled the morning. Languages, philosophy, etiquette, and the endless study of proper royal bearing. Every bow had to be practiced, every phrase rehearsed until it carried the exact weight of elegance. Aldrich listened, his eyes distant, his voice polite. Inside, however, he longed for quiet, not the kind found in the palace, but the peace of being unseen. By midday, the castle was alive with movement. Courtiers filled the corridors, their robes sweeping over the stone floors. The queen's ladies whispered behind fans, sharing news of distant lords and their scandals. In the great hall, the king held council, voices rising and falling, echoing against the high ceilings. Aldrich sat beside him, silent, learning the art of stillness. To speak too freely was dangerous, to speak too little was weakness. He often watched his father, King Edric, with a mixture of awe and sorrow. The king's face was lined with years of duty, his eyes sharp but weary. He wore his crown as though it were a wound that never healed. When he smiled, it was thin and careful. One afternoon, as the council dismissed and the great doors closed, Aldrich found himself alone with his father in the echoing hall. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass, painting their faces in colors of gold and crimson. "Father," Aldrich said softly, "do you ever wish to leave it all, even for a day?" The king's gaze lingered on him, unreadable. "A king does not wish, my son. He endures." That was the way of royalty. Life was endurance, the art of smiling when the heart wished to flee. In the evenings, when the castle quieted, Aldrich would sometimes wander through the corridors alone. The flicker of torches cast long shadows on the walls, and the silence became almost sacred. He would pause by the tall windows overlooking the sleeping town below, the faint lights of cottages twinkling like fallen stars. He imagined the laughter drifting up from the taverns, the smell of bread baking, the hum of songs sung without fear. For them, the world was simple: live, love, survive. For him, it was a performance without end. The queen often told him that royalty must never show loneliness, that a monarch's strength came from mystery. And so Aldrich hid behind the same stillness his father had mastered, a calm surface above a restless heart. The strangest part of royal life, though, was its silence. No one spoke freely. Servants never made eye contact. Courtiers never disagreed unless it was part of a plan. Every conversation was a careful dance. Even laughter, when it happened, felt rehearsed. Aldrich's only moments of genuine peace came during the late hours of night, when everyone else slept. He would slip away from his chamber, past the guards who pretended not to see, and make his way to the old tower. It was said to be haunted, and so no one dared follow. From there, he could see the entire valley, the moon resting gently on the hills, the faint shimmer of the river winding through the darkness. One night, as he stood there wrapped in his cloak, he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned, and saw her. It was Alara, one of the queen's attendants, carrying a lantern. Her eyes widened when she realized he was there. "Your Highness, forgive me. I didn't mean to intrude." He smiled faintly. "You're not intruding. You're the first person to come here in years." She hesitated. "It's quiet here. Peaceful. It's the only place that feels real," Aldrich replied. That night marked the beginning of something strange, a friendship that neither of them could speak of. In a world where every word was watched, they found comfort in silence. Sometimes they spoke of the world beyond, of rivers, forests, markets. Other times, they said nothing at all, sitting side by side as the wind whispered through the cracks of the tower. Through Alara, Aldrich began to understand the world his crown had hidden from him. She spoke of ordinary joys, the smell of rain, the warmth of bread fresh from the oven, the way music could fill a room with life. These were things he had never known, though he lived surrounded by everything. But secrets never stay hidden in royal halls. The whispers began soon after, rumors of the prince seen walking the tower at night, of a servant girl vanishing at dawn. The queen's ladies began to watch Alara closely, their smiles sharp as daggers. The advisor, Lord Renwick, spoke quietly to the king about improper company. And so, one morning, Alara was gone. They told Aldrich she had been sent to another court, that she had been rewarded for her service. But he knew better. The tower felt emptier than ever, the silence heavier. In the weeks that followed, Aldrich spoke less and less. The crown seemed to grow heavier each day, even though it had yet to rest upon his head. He realized then what his father had meant: endurance. To be royal was to lose quietly, again and again, without anyone noticing. As winter settled over Castevel, the castle grew colder. The king's health began to fail, and the burden of rule slowly shifted toward the young prince. Yet Aldrich felt no joy, no sense of victory. Power was not freedom. It was another layer of chains, polished to shine like gold. He began to dream of leaving, not forever, but long enough to remember what it felt like to live as himself. Sometimes, as he lay awake in the pale blue light before dawn, he imagined walking out beyond the gates, leaving behind the silks and crowns, becoming no one. And yet, when morning came, he rose again. He let the attendants dress him, he smiled when expected, and he sat through another day of rituals and silence. For royalty, that was life, not joy, not tragedy, but a strange, endless in-between. Outside, the world turned. Inside, time barely moved. And in that stillness, behind the heavy doors of gold, the young prince carried a quiet truth that no one around him dared to see. Even in a palace of perfection, loneliness could echo louder than bells. The weeks following the king's decline were heavy with silence. The once bright corridors of Castevel had grown dim, their torches flickering low as though the very stones felt the weight of uncertainty. Every servant moved in whispers, every footstep softened by dread. The court physicians came and went like shadows, their faces grave and unreadable. And through it all, Prince Aldrich waited, not with hope, but with a kind of tired calm that had become his companion. When the bells finally rang, announcing the king's passing, Aldrich stood still by the window of his chamber. The snow had begun to fall, slow and soundless, wrapping the castle in white. He felt no tears, only a strange emptiness, like standing at the edge of a quiet sea. Down in the courtyard, courtiers gathered in black velvet, their breath misting in the cold air. They wept for the king, though some wept for what they might lose. Nobles bowed, priests chanted, and banners hung low in mourning. But Aldrich, standing apart, felt as though the world had folded in on itself. The man who had once been his guide, his warning, and his mirror, was gone. And with him, the last thin thread holding Aldrich's youth had vanished. That night, the crown was brought before him. It rested upon a velvet cushion, its jewels dull in the candlelight. The archbishop spoke the old words, the ones that had been said for centuries, each syllable echoing through the cold hall. Aldrich's hands trembled as the crown touched his head. It was heavier than he had ever imagined. The courtiers cheered softly, their voices blending into a strange hum, admiration mixed with calculation. Aldrich bowed his head, his eyes half closed. He thought not of power, not of legacy, but of freedom, the kind he knew he would never have again. Days became weeks, and King Aldrich began to rule. At first, the court saw little change. The ceremonies continued, the banquets sparkled, and the royal decrees were written in the same elegant ink. But beneath that polished surface, something quiet was shifting. He began to rise before dawn, not for ritual, but to walk the halls alone. The servants whispered of seeing him near the old tower, his cloak trailing softly behind him, as though he still searched for someone who had vanished long ago. One morning, as the sun rose pale and thin over the snowy hills, he entered the small chapel where his father used to pray. The place was empty except for the faint scent of burning oil and the distant drip of water from the ceiling. He knelt, not to ask for blessings, but to listen. The silence there was sacred, not because of the gods, but because it was honest. He thought of Alara then. Her laughter. Her courage to speak freely, when no one else dared. She had once told him, a crown can hide a man, but it cannot change what his heart remembers. He had smiled at the time, thinking her words sweet but naive. Now he understood. That day, Aldrich made his first decree, quiet and small. But unlike anything his ancestors had done. He ordered that the townspeople be invited into the castle once a month, to share their stories and grievances directly with the crown. The court was scandalized. "Your Majesty," said Lord Renwick, his voice sharp with disbelief, "it is not fitting for peasants to stand before the throne. It diminishes the dignity of the crown." Aldrich looked at him calmly. "Dignity," he said softly, "does not come from distance." The hall fell silent. From that moment, whispers began to spread, some calling him foolish, others calling him kind. As the months passed, the castle slowly changed. The grand halls that had once echoed only with courtly chatter began to fill with the murmurs of ordinary folk, farmers, merchants, even children. Their voices, rough and real, carried a life that the marble walls had never known. Aldrich listened. He learned of their struggles, poor harvests, cold winters, lost loved ones. He did not promise miracles. He only listened, and somehow, that was enough. For the first time, people began to speak of the castle not as a fortress of pride, but as a home that breathed again. Yet peace, in the world of royalty, never lasts long. One evening, as the sun melted behind the hills, Lord Renwick requested a private audience. The old advisor's expression was calm, but there was steel beneath his words. "Your Majesty," he began, "the court grows restless. They say your kindness makes you weak. They fear the people will forget their place." Aldrich smiled faintly. "Perhaps," he said, "it is not weakness they fear, but change." Renwick's gaze hardened. "Change breaks kingdoms." Aldrich looked toward the window, where the faint lights of the village flickered like stars. Then perhaps it is time something broke, he whispered. That night, alone in his chamber, Aldrich took out an old piece of parchment he had kept hidden for years, a simple note, written in Alara's hand before she was taken away. The ink had faded, but the words still glowed softly under the candlelight. The world is larger than these walls, Aldrich. Promise me you'll see it one day. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. The next morning, before dawn, he left the castle. He wore a plain cloak, no crown, no guards, just a man walking through the mist. The snow had begun to melt, revealing dark patches of earth beneath. The air smelled of wet stone and pine. He walked down the old path that led to the village, his boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. No one recognized him at first. The villagers bowed politely as he passed, assuming he was a traveler. He stopped by the market, bought a loaf of bread, and sat on a stone wall to eat it. The taste was simple and warm, the first thing that had felt real in years. He spoke with the baker, with the children playing near the fountain, with the old woman who told stories about the days before the castle stood. He listened, laughed quietly, and felt, for a brief moment, utterly human. When he returned to the castle that evening, his cloak dusted with snow, the guards looked startled. But he said nothing of where he had gone. He only smiled, as though carrying a secret too gentle to share. From that day on, his rule changed in quiet ways. He ordered that the great feasts include the townsfolk, that the castle gates remain open during festivals, that music be played not only for the nobles but for the servants who kept the fire alive. The court was bewildered, some even left in protest. Yet Aldrich remained calm, his voice soft, his eyes serene. He had learned that true strength was not in the weight of the crown, but in the lightness of compassion. Years passed. The castle aged, but its heart grew warmer. The servants laughed again. Children ran through the gardens that had once been forbidden. The king often walked among them, his presence quiet but kind, his crown worn like an afterthought. In the evenings, he would climb the old tower once more, now repaired and filled with candles. From its window, he would watch the valley, the rivers glowing under the moon, the distant fires of the village, the steady hum of life. Sometimes he imagined Alara sitting beside him again, her lantern glowing softly, her eyes bright with unspoken dreams. He would smile and whisper to the empty air, "You were right. The world is larger than these walls." As the years drew on, the people of Castabel began to speak of their king not as the ruler who changed laws or conquered lands, but as the man who made the castle feel like home. And when, at last, King Aldrich's time came, the bells did not ring in sorrow, but in gratitude. The villagers gathered outside the castle walls, holding candles in the soft twilight, their faces glowing with quiet love. They said that when he passed, his last words were not of power or legacy, but of peace. He whispered, "I am free now." That night, as snow fell gently over the valley, the castle stood silent once more. But it was a different kind of silence, not the cold hush of loneliness, but the calm stillness of rest. And if one were to walk the halls of Castabel today, they would find traces of that strange and gentle king in every corner, the warmth in the servants' laughter, the softness in the songs sung at night, the peace that lingered long after the candles burned out. Because the weird life of royalty, it seemed, had always been misunderstood. It was not just about crowns and gold, or the strangeness of rituals and rules. It was about learning to find humanity in a world that demanded perfection. And perhaps that is the truest story of all, that even in the grandest castles, beneath layers of history and silk, the hearts that beat inside were just as fragile, and just as full of dreams, as anyone else's.